thank you all for joining us. My name is Kathy. I'm the Philanthropy and Outreach Coordinator at the Adirondack Land Trust. And I will start out by thanking DAC Bar for sponsoring tonight's event. DAC Bar uses only unprocessed and unaltered foods that provide pure energy while delivering what I can personally promise is the best tasting energy bar on the market. DAC Bar's 1% Wild program donates 1% of their profits to conservation groups like the Adirondack Land Trust that protect the wild places we love to play in. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris Jage, Conservation Program Director for the Adirondack Land Trust, who will get us started tonight.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure, and I'm really excited to share this presentation. Tonight, we wanted to give you a look into a new way that the Land Trust is approaching our conservation work and the relationship between these protected places and the plant and animal and human communities connected to them. The Land Trust has a nearly 40-year history of protecting forests, waters, wild places all across the Adirondacks. And when you do what we do for as long as we've been doing it, you think a lot about protection, that word, protection. What do we protect? Where do we protect it? How do we protect things? And one thing that we at the Land Trust and also Land Trusts like us across the country are thinking about is, what does protection really mean? Are we protecting the right things? And who and what are we protecting these places from? And maybe, can we do this a little better? If you go back in history and think about some of the United States' best known conservation achievements, like Yosemite National Park, they have protection backstories that also included prejudice, deceit, and violence. And the conservation champions of that era thought that to protect true nature or true wilderness meant the removal of all the people that have lived on those lands for hundreds and thousands of years, without a passing thought that, one, those folks might have something to do with why those lands are the way they are, and two, that they have a collective built knowledge of understanding of the natural world that non-native ecologists are still trying to attain. And this is borne out by modern science by even saying that about 80% of the planet's biodiversity is under the care of indigenous communities right now. So this type of non-native land protection has changed over the years, but at its core, it still contains the elements of gaining ownership or control of land. You set new rules for the land and its users, and you rely on property rights laws and the US legal system to uphold those rules. But these concepts are just one way to envision land protection and one way to envision a relationship between people and land. So if we can imagine that we take a different relationship and with different perspectives and values and do protection in that context, how would that look and how would that be different? So the Adirondack Land Trust, we live and we work primarily in the lands of the Kanietakeron or Mohawk people. Which is part of the larger Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy of 6 Native nations. And we're fortunate over the years to learn a bit of their knowledge, their perspectives, and their relationship to the natural world, and how caring for the land and for the people is not just interrelated, but in fact interdependent. And through this learning and sharing, a protection project emerged in a partnership with the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center in Onshioda and the Fadden family that's operated it for 70 years, excuse me. So this started by a chance meeting between one of our staff members and Dave Fadden, pictured here, who represents part of the 3rd generation that has run that cultural center. And we formed a partnership on the Fadden's desire to acquire a neighboring parcel, about 300 acres, so it could become the new home for the cultural center, but also give that cultural center a home on the land where traditional teachings, learnings, and practices could return to that land and also be shared with others. So as part of this partnership, we also wanted to craft a new way for the center and the Land Trust to work together in the care of this land moving forward. Now, typically a land trust like us would use what's known as a conservation easement as a tool to achieve these conservation objectives. And this tool allows us to tailor the agreement and its rules to each unique parcel of land. And these easements last forever, which means the land trust and the landowner have this perpetual relationship to ensure that the specific terms of the easement are being met. But in this case, and for a variety of reasons, this tried and true tool, at least in its current form or in its traditional form, it just wasn't the right tool. It wasn't the right for this partnership. In this case, we wanted to take that regular conservation easement, but tear it down to the studs. So leaving just the bare minimum in place so that we could build it back with indigenous values, knowledge, and principles on how to care for the land. One of the first concepts that we gravitated towards is actually rooted in the first agreement that the Haudenosaunee made with the Europeans that came to settle on this continent. It's what's known as the Goswenta, or the Two-Row Wampum Treaty. And in short, this treaty speaks to is the importance of maintaining respect, communication, sovereignty, and dignity between two different people that now live amongst each other. Unfortunately, it's not exactly how this relationship has played out historically, but this treaty and its principles still exist. And we are all still party to this treaty, and we want to recover its spirit in this work together with the center. And the next thing that emerged was the thought of centering this agreement around the Haudenosaunee concept of gratitude, particularly as it's expressed in the Thanksgiving Address. And this sense of gratitude, as opposed to control of the natural world, I think strikes a tone that resonates not just with Haudenosaunee, but arguably with non-native conservationists as well. And I'll say it certainly has for me. I mean, when I was first exposed to this, it reminded me of when I first read Aldo Leopold, when I was just getting into this field of conservation. And the quote that I think captures this to some degree is, he said that we abuse land because we view it as a commodity that belongs to us. When we see it as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dave Kanietakeron Fadden so that he can explain this concept more thoroughly and what it means to the new cultural center and the land on which it will sit.
Yeah, we'll go, Chris. Thanks. Sayagwego. Kanietakeron is my name. Kanietakeron in English translates to mean patches of snow. I was born mid-March, and my great-grandmother gave me that name, Kanietakeron. And it's I often wondered why I got that name, because I was raised in the Adirondacks. And if you're familiar with the mountains in mid-March, we usually still have about 10 foot of snow. And it wasn't until I moved to Akwesasne, Mohawk territory, right along the St. Lawrence River, and that's where I am right now. When I moved here on my first birthday here, I noticed that there was patches of snow, and that's where my great-grandmother lived. And so that became my name, Kanietakeron. And we could take up a whole lot of time telling this story, but I'm going to try to sum it up pretty quickly, because I want to leave some time for questions, and that's where a good dialogue really starts, with questions. And Chris mentioned the Thanksgiving address, and that's in Mohawk they say Ohén Kariwatékwen. And what that means is the words that come before all else. And Ohén Kariwatékwen is something that is spoken at every gathering, whether it be political, spiritual, weddings, even funerals. These words are spoken. And what these words do is we address every part of the natural world, of our creation, our home. It takes time to go through this, but the speaker is designated to talk and express gratitude and acknowledgement of these things that we see, that we feel, that keep us alive. And what happens is when the speaker gets up to say these words, there's a response from the audience, and they send their message of agreement back to him or her. And it usually starts with greeting all the people that have gathered and that we all arrive safely, just like I would greet all of you who arrive safely via Zoom, and that we're all healthy and happy living on this place, the earth. Then we turn our attention to the earth itself. And among our people, among a lot of other native indigenous people, we call the earth our mother. And like all mothers, she provides everything for us to exist. Our lives are dependent on our mothers. And so we gather our minds together as one voice, and we greet our mother, the earth, and send gratitude. Then we move on to the waters, and all the waters. Without water, we're done. We wouldn't last long. As they say, water is life. And we address the waters, the rivers, the streams, the brooks, and we acknowledge all water life and send greetings and thank you. And from there, we turn our attentions to the fish. In Gaju, in Mohawk, they say the fish helps sustain our bodies and is very healthy. And we acknowledge them and send greetings. Then we turn our attention to the grasses, the medicinal plants, the roots of those plants. They provide not only sustenance, but also they have medicinal qualities. And we gather our minds together as one, and we acknowledge and send greetings of thanks to the plant life. Then the three sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash, those are the primary life sustainers among the Haudenosaunee people. We were agriculturalists, we were farmers, and those crops sustained our people, and they still do to this very day. So we acknowledge the three sisters and send our gratitude. Then we talk to the fruits that we harvest in the fall, and just out my window, there's apple trees. And every fall, we have a bountiful harvest of apples. So we acknowledge the fruits and give thanks. Then we acknowledge the insects that creep and crawl, and some fly through the air. And we acknowledge them and their importance on this earth, especially the bee. And without the bee, those plants wouldn't grow. And without the bee, our lives would cease. And so we send our acknowledgement and our greeting to the bees and the insects. And then we turn our attention to the animals that sustain us. They feed us. In the old days, they give us clothing. We send our greetings and thanks to the animal life. Then, of course, we talk to the trees, all the beautiful trees that surround us. The trees provide us heat in the winter, and they shelter us all year round. We acknowledge the trees and send our gratitude. And the ones that fly around the trees, we acknowledge the birds, their songs that lighten our hearts. We acknowledge the bird life, and we send greetings and thanks. Then next, we talk to Latiwelas, or our thunderers, that we hear, the thunder when it comes. And it's acknowledging them. And when we hear them, we know the rain is coming to replenish the water. And so we greet Latiwelas and send our thanks to the thunderers. Then we talk to the wind that refreshes the air that we breathe. And sometimes it's cold and sometimes it's warm, but we acknowledge those winds that come, and we send greetings and thank you. From there, we talk to the sun, our elder brother, and the sun keeps us warm, and it's the heat that we feel. And the sun is getting higher in the sky, and we acknowledge the sun and give thanks. Then we turn our attention to the moon, or Galakwa, when we call our grandmother. The grandmother, the moon, is the one who oversees female life. Babies are born according to the moon, our grandmother. And so we acknowledge her and send greetings and thank you. And from the moon, we look up to the stars in the night, and they guide us throughout the year. And there's certain stars we watch as they move that remind us. Sometimes it's time to plant. Sometimes it's to celebrate our new year. And collectively, we gather our minds all together as one, and we acknowledge that and we send greetings and thank you. And that is a real short version of the Ohén Kanietakeron. Now, depending on the speaker, when somebody is designated to speak, they can go at length. And I remember when I was a kid, there was an old guy, when he started the Thanksgiving address, sometimes it could take about 20 minutes or more. And he would talk about every part of creation. And he even talked about behind his barn, he had one of those old water pumps. And he would describe it and talk to it and say, give thanks to that pump for bringing water. And so it all depends on the speaker. Now, a lot of non-native folks in this country, and maybe even around the world, are drawn to those types of words. They feel a connection to the earth. They feel a connection to the trees, the mountains, the rivers, the streams. And they might have it in their heart, but sometimes the words don't come out. At every gathering that I've been to with non-natives, nobody ever says these words in the beginning. It's only in our native communities where before anything else takes place, these words are spoken. And these philosophies are shared, but it's just finding the connection using words. And when I met the folks at the Land Trust, also at the Wild Center in Tupper Lake and other organizations, they have the same philosophy, but it's just how do you put it into words, as Chris pointed out, you look at it as a community. And I heard long ago, there was an Onondaga guy who said, we're not above all of these things. These things in creation aren't put here for us. And that's arrogant. And in time, it'll be dangerous. And then we're learning now that it is dangerous and we're in a critical stage in our existence. He says we're somewhere between the ant and the mountain. This is our home. And he was speaking to the United Nations in Geneva. And he looked in the audience, all these faces from all around the world. And he looked and he said, I don't see a seat for the eagle. Where's the seat for the deer? Who speaks for them? For all those creatures and entities in our creation, who speaks for them? And so the Haudenosaunee, since the 70s, and maybe even before, in other indigenous nations, will speak on their behalf. Because we have that rooted connection, and it all is found, the foundation of it is the Ohén Kanietakeron. Now, he also brought about the two-row concept. And the two-row is a treaty, an agreement that was originated in the 1600s and originated with the Dutch in the Haudenosaunee. Excuse me. And the concept is quite simple. And as you saw in that graphic, there were two rows of purple wampum beads that went parallel. And one row is the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee are in their canoe going down the river of life. And within that canoe is everything about them. Our language, our customs, our beliefs, our political structure. Everything about the Haudenosaunee is in that canoe. Next to us is the Dutch, and later the French, the English, and ultimately the Americans in their ship, going down that same river of life. And contained within that ship is everything about them, their laws, their beliefs, their language, their ways. Those two go parallel throughout life. They never try to interfere with each other, but they live and exist in friendship. And the white wampum that goes between them is symbolic of peace and friendship. So we go down parallel, never interfering with each other, but we help each other if there's a need. In the Adirondack Land Trust, they're in their ship, and I was in my canoe and I needed help. And I met a lady from the Adirondack Land Trust, and she helped us out. And so that was the beginning of this relationship. And from the beginning, we always looked at it in that way, that we're two people, but we share the same philosophies towards the earth, towards creation, to reach a goal. And one of the goals is about preservation, conservation, to leave it alone, take care of it. And that's another thing about our people is, there's certain concepts that were very foreign to us. And now even one is ownership of land. It's very different. Now, I heard it referred to as this elder says, nobody can own land. You can't own it. You can't put it in your pocket. It's similar to saying, this is my heir. You can't have it. No, that's mine. You can't own it. You can sustain yourselves by a certain amount of land, take care of our families and raise our families through generations. But you can't own it. And we have agreements with other people. And one of them, another one that I don't know if I've mentioned to Chris before, is they call it the dish with one spoon. And I have a replica right here. And this is a wampum belt. And I believe it goes way, way, way back. And it's an agreement with other indigenous people. And the one especially was the Anishinaabe. And we made an agreement with them. And the symbolism is that that dish is similar to the land and everything on that land that can sustain people. The fish, the deer, the food plants. And the understanding is that we all eat out of that same bowl. There's only one. And they always use a spoon. You never use a knife or a fork because it could hurt the other person. And so all of those gifts on this land are in that bowl, and we share from it collectively. And there were other agreements made with the one with the Lenni Lenape, Delaware, the Mohicans, I believe the Abenaki. And the symbol of a wampum belt is it was a zigzag design, and that represented a trail. And the concept is that if our people, or for whatever reason, are hungry or we need food, we can follow that trail onto their territory and to harvest the deer or food and come home. And the same goes true if they're hungry and they need help, they can come onto ours and we can help them. And so the idea of ownership of land is a little different than a Western way of looking at it. Among the Haudenosaunee, there's what we call the Guyana Let Go, or the Great Law of Peace. I mean, that's a long, beautiful story that can take up to 10 days to recite by memory. And in this story, it talks about how the 5 original nations united to become one. And when they united, they devised a system which they call the Guyana Let Go, or in the English, the closest you could say is the Great Law of Peace. And in that story, there's a section where it talks about our homes and where we live. And there was an idea that if you take a broom and you put it in your doorway, that's to let everyone know that no one's home. And so it's understood and respected to not enter. And so that is the closest semblance of any idea of like ownership per se. But the land itself, there are agreements with people all around that we take care of it. And another concept is you don't take anything from the forest, from the rivers, the trees, anything. Don't take more than you need. And that's tantamount. That's a rule. You only take what you need and you don't abuse it. And we don't have a word for natural resources in our language. And so when we're crafting this conservation easement, we're going to approach it like the 2-row. And so the Adirondack Land Trust will have their rules and their ways describing an easement. And on our side, we'll talk about how we view the land and how we intend to use it. But our tradition is you leave it alone. Again, you only take what you need and you leave it alone. even my grandfather would say, when you're in the woods, you always go single file. So that way you're not spread out, stepping on all the plants. You follow each other. So our footprint doesn't do too much damage to the land. And I carried that with me my whole life. And even my grandfather, we go for walks down the road. You see the ants building their houses. And I remember I went to a public school and I remember kids would run over and destroy them senselessly. But I remember my grandfather, he would always say, "Oh, watch out, don't step on the ants because they have a right to be here too." And so all of these concepts about preservation, conservation, they're taught to Haudenosaunee people from the beginning. And when this partnership came about, and I'll tell you the story how it happened. In 2020, the pandemic hit. And of course, everyone knows everything was shut down, everyone went home. And that was the first summer since 1954 that we didn't open our little cultural center. So we had time, we didn't know what to do. I did a lot of hiking and canoeing. It was great. It was like the first summer I've had in a lot of years. And we became aware of a couple, a retired couple from not too far from Achayota, who indicated to us that they wanted to help us. And I think the pandemic scared them, because a lot of people were dying and they were elderly and they had some investments, they had some funds, and they wanted to help us. And so they indicated to us that whatever we need, they would help to preserve our little museum. And so the only problem was we weren't a not-for-profit. We've always done this work almost like a side business during the summer. We're never in it for money. It was always about education and sharing our culture. Began with my grandfather. And so in the summer before, we had a visitor. It was a lawyer from New York City who was, when we were talking, we mentioned that we'd like to make improvements to our collection in the building, and it's a modest 4-room structure. And if you're not familiar with the museum, if you get a chance, you should visit. It's jam-packed full of artifacts and knowledge and culture. Even the floors are painted different designs and all the way up to the peak. And the only thing is there's no insulation and there's no cooling and no heating. And so we're only seasonal. And what's damaging for that collection is those hot, humid days that we get in the summer. And basically anything that's up in the ceiling gets cooked. And so they wanted to help us. And the idea got big fast. And so we wanted to have a new building to actually house the old building. That was the concept, the idea, is to build around the old building, because the old building in itself has become an artifact. And it's an amazing place. And then I called a good friend of mine who worked for the Adirondack Park Agency, and I think he was retired by then, to check out the land and the site to see if we could build. And so we hiked around, and there's a little brook called the John Thomas Brook that runs through our property. And there's a lot of wetland in the area. And he marked it off where the wetland was and where we wanted to move the building and have a new building built, and there just wasn't enough room. So we started thinking, what are we gonna do? And but that lawyer, we went ahead and became a not-for-profit, did all that. And so November of 2020, we became a not-for-profit. And then in August, we got our 501c3 through the IRS. Around that time, I became aware of the land that sits adjacent to my mother's land was up for sale. And I was like, boy, I want that land. It's beautiful. And so I was at the museum one day, and that lady came in. Her name's Mary Thill. I don't know if she wants anybody to know. But she came in, and we were just chit-chatting with our masks on. And I says, "Oh, where do you work?" And she says, "Oh, Adirondack Land Trust." And I'm like, "Oh, what do you guys do?" She says, "Oh, we buy land for conservation and preservation." I was like, "Oh, I know where there's some land for sale." And that was the beginning. Next thing I knew, I was meeting with Chris, Megan, and others from the Adirondack Land Trust, and these meetings started, and we got excited. You know, this they were on board. They're going to help us acquire this property. It was 333 acres, and so we had a little bit of funds to get it surveyed and got it appraised, and it was pretty pricey. And then I had to raise half. And another side story, there was another good friend who I'm an artist, by the way. I paint, and from time to time he commissions me to do paintings. This one over the winter, I believe it was 2021, he commissioned me to actually do a portrait of his dog, which was pretty neat. And so I did the painting, and then when he came to pick it up, we had a little discussion, and I told him about the land, and I had to raise this money to be able to buy it. And we just didn't have an appraisal at that time. And then he goes, "Well, just let me know, and I might be able to help." Okay. And so time went on, and we finally got it appraised and agreed upon price. And I sent him a quick email and didn't hear from him for a while. And a couple of weeks went by. The next thing I knew, he says, "Are you going to be in the area?" And I said, "Sure." And he showed up was at my parents' house and showed up at the door. First thing he did was handed me a check for the amount I needed to raise. And that was it. And I quickly got on the email, talked to Chris. The next thing I knew, we were signing the papers. The land became ours. So with this agreement and with this easement that we're drafting, proposing, is pretty unique in New York State. And I think Chris later on can maybe talk more about this, in that 24 acres is set aside for the development of a new cultural center. And that, by the way, is in this past year, I've been working with engineers and an architect who joined our team to design a new place. And that is another alignment of the stars that happened that year. Was I gave a presentation to a writer for National Geographic, and he was writing an article about sovereignty among Indigenous people. His name is Charles Mann, and he wrote a book called 1491. It's a very good read. And he also wrote a book called 1493. But I was really excited to meet him, and I gave a presentation about the Great Law, Gonna Let Go. And during our discussion, I talked about our plans of building a new building, and then he was talking to my brother, and my brother mentioned that, we don't have an architect. We got to look around. And then Charles Mann, he looked over at him and he says, goes, "Well, my wife's an architect, and she does a lot of pro bono work for Indigenous communities." Really? Next thing I knew, I was Zooming meetings with her name's Ray Mann, and she's been on board ever since, and a really nice lady, and doing a lot of good work creating a new facility. But that's where the 24 acres of that 333, that's surveyed off to be the new cultural center. The remainder of that land is going to be protected forever. As long as there's humans around, we'll protect it. We'll utilize it in a traditional way. We'll have trails. We'll have lean-tos. We might have a longhouse. But it'll be a place, another classroom, to bring our youth from Akwesasne and other Native communities to come, to spend the night, to explore that land, and to learn about traditional uses of plants, to learn how to track an animal, and just simply to experience that place. Because we're living in a time where a lot of youth and adults don't get the chance to experience what I've experienced my whole life, and that's the Adirondacks. The most beautiful place, and we'll open it up for non-native, the local kids, groups, to come to camp, to learn. And so it'll be a big classroom. And so we're very excited. And these go back to my grandfather's mission. And in the beginning, in 1954, when he opened that little museum and he opened the door to the public. The mission was twofold. One, it was for our own kids, our own Kanietakeron, Mohawk, and Haudenosaunee children, because a lot of our culture at that time was starting to erode and disappear for various factors. And one of them was the policy the United States and Canada had towards Indigenous communities was one of forced assimilation. And how you do that is you take their children from these Native communities, you put them in these boarding schools, all spread out through across the country. And if they speak their language, they're punished severely in some cases. And so my grandmother ended up in one of those places, and it was run by a church, the nuns. It was a convent. It was a school. And she didn't speak English very well. She spoke Mohawk. And anytime she spoke Mohawk, she had to put her hands out and they'd give her a strap. I think it was 10 lashings. Horrible food, neglect. And ultimately she lost the ability to speak her language. It just kind of just disappeared. And that is partially why I don't speak. I'm not fluent, because my first words were Mohawk, but I grew up surrounded by English. And when I would talk to my grandmother, maybe in Mohawk, she would reaffirm it in English. And so I kind of lost the fluency. My grandfather was a school teacher here at Akwesasne, and he could see these young Mohawk kids really didn't have a sense of their identity, of who they were. And so it wasn't allowed in those days to teach the culture, especially the language wasn't allowed to teach in the public schools. And so he had to do it underground and be quiet about it. And what he did is he'd have a kid out in the hallway as a lookout to watch out for the non-native principal. And he'd tell them stories, teach them songs, teach them the language as much as he could. And what he was doing was reinstilling that sense of pride in who they were as Kanietakeron people. And ultimately, he formed a group called the Akwesasne Mohawk Counselors Organization. And these were a group of young people, probably about 12, 13 years old. And they would travel all over. And they'd go hiking, they'd go canoeing, they'd visit museums, and they go to other reservations. And their headquarters, their like home base, became Chayota in the mountains. And they had a little camp. And it was then somebody was visiting him, saw his living room and says, "Boy, your living room looks like a museum." So that gave him the idea. So 1954, he built what was then called the Six Nations Indian Museum. But in 2020, we changed it to the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. That's the first reason. It was for our own people. The next reason we're there is everyone else. A lot of people, Americans, Canadians, really don't have an idea of who we are as people. Like when I went to school many years ago, I think they had a week-long course about the Native people of New York State. Of course, I aced it, but that was it. That's all I remember learning. We did a project and that was it. The following year, we spent the whole year learning about European history. I never learned about the Quechua of Peru, the Mayan, the Aztec, the Navajo, the Comanche, the Lakota, Anishinaabe, the Mi'kmaq, Inuit. I never learned about any of them. So all around this country, there's ignorance, I guess is the word. People just simply don't know. They're not taught. And what they do know in a lot of cases is they get from what they see on television or the old John Wayne movies, or in contemporary times, they think about Indigenous people when they see the Kansas City Chiefs play. And they hear that tomahawk chop. I couldn't even watch the Super Bowl this year. I just can't stand it. That's today, 2024. And so our job as educators is to tell our story in such a way that when they leave that door, they'll have a different way of looking. They're thinking about Indigenous people, hopefully. And that's our job. And we've been doing this this will be our 70th year in the third generation. And it's really exciting times. We're growing, we're expanding. And with help from the folks at the Adirondack Land Trust and others, we have a good future ahead of us. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Kathy.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Thanks to Dave and Chris. This is fantastic. And I would echo what Dave said. If you have not been to the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center, I encourage you to go. It's fantastic. It's just a wonder, and can't get enough. We are ready for some questions from audience members, and again, we'll get to as many as we can. We'll also send answers later via email for those we don't get to, but we do have one question, and I think, Dave, this one is for you. How can people learn more about the Cultural Center and this project and get involved, either through helping to fundraise or volunteer work?
Well, that's a good question. Ever since we became a not-for-profit, we got to go by another set of rules, but we need to raise money for the new cultural center. But to learn more about us, we have a website. It's the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center, but it's the number 6nicc.com. We're on social media, and we try to keep that going up to date. And we're going to revamp our website in coming months, because the one thing that was pointed out to me that we don't have is a donation button. And so that's one of our priorities, is to have that set up. But folks that have helped us out so far have just shown up and handed us a check, and they give them a receipt with our tax information so they can get a tax deductible donation. And so in coming months, I'm going to be really making a push, because we've done all the planning, the engineer work is done, and the architect is hard at work getting the final plans ready. And hopefully this summer or potentially fall, we'll be able to break ground on a new place. The first thing we're going to do is actually build a smaller structure, a building we call it a work building, and that will actually house the overflow of artifacts that we have in our collection. Because right now, my mother's house, my house is full of artifacts that we just have nowhere to display, and people donate something they had in their family. I just had one email today. There was a guy who had a really neat poster from, I think, the 50s. He wants to donate. I don't know where to put it. I don't have anywhere to put it. And so that's the first step, is to have a space to work and to have a place to store our artifacts in a more climate controlled manner. Plus, I'm working from home every day, and it'd be nice to have a place to go to work. But the main push is for the bigger building, and that it's going to take a number of years. But any help, it's always appreciated. That's for sure. But you could just follow us on that, Facebook, Instagram, and our website as well.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And I see that we've put the Facebook page and the cultural center's URLs into the chat, so everyone should feel free to check those out. I have a question here for Chris. Chris, you said at the beginning that this conservation partnership was going to be different from the other work that you do with the Adirondack Land Trust. Can you be more specific about that? How will it be different?
Yeah. So, well, first I'll say that, this is a work in progress because it's new, and we're sort of, Dave and I are sort of moving together as we figure this out. And but again, we started with this concept. We have these things called conservation easements, and they tend to work to do things like this. But when you look at a conservation easement, I've never looked at it from another culture's perspective before, and how it just didn't seem to be the right way to do this. So sort of pulled out a lot of the a lot of the elements of it. But the first thing that we did, as David mentioned, like we begin it with the words that come before all else. And that statement of gratitude about all of the things that we care, like why do we protect land? It's because we have a relationship and a care about the plants and the animals and the waters and the soils and all that. And we just say that, it's just said out front in both English and in Mohawk. And then when it gets beyond there, it really talks about the partnership. And again, thinking about the two row is that the land trust and the center have responsibilities to the land, and we have responsibilities to each other. And so it's really written more as like it's going to be written, I should say, more as a partnership and things like that on how we care for all of these elements of Mother Earth that we're or that we're responsible for. And I think the last bit is, that things might not always go well, right? And so how do you handle conflict and disagreement? And there is another case where we're going to lean more into Mohawk ways of dealing with disagreement than, I said before, like, or, a traditional easement uses the legal system and things like that, which, is just the nature of how these things are built. But you don't always have to, settle the disagreements. There's different ways to do that. So those are some of the ideas that we're hoping to bake into this. And I've seen other examples of folks heading towards this, but not one that is sort of being built more from traditional values and perspectives than what we're trying to do here. So Dave, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I think it's that approach that's it's going to work. Like I just have this feeling it's a good way of going. Like you say with the conflicts that there's different ways of viewing or resolving conflict, and what I like about this is and I was as we're crafting this easement on our end, I've been talking to a lot of folks about how do we approach this, and in the beginning I was really and I don't know for what reason, but I kept reading what you wrote, and it's like, oh, am I supposed to? I didn't understand right away how I'm going to do it, and I think we met about it, or I emailed and we talked, and just says, how do you approach land? What do you think? And I was like, well, then I started talking about it, and then I said, do it that way. And then the more I'm digging and talking and reading about land, and there's actually my mother-in-law pointed out that a lot of that is in our oral tradition. It's in our creation story in the beginning. It's in the Guyana Let Go, the Great Law. It's all there. You just got to find it and pick and choose. And when I dug around in our creation story, and that's another story that takes many, many hours to recite by memory. And it talks about how our people, all humans, started to forget the value of the land, the value of the earth, and started to lean a different way, or maybe war or things like that. And you forget to be thankful. And then you're reminded again by, in these stories, there's maybe a spirit or an entity comes to remind us about being appreciative of this earth, be thankful. And ceremonies were forgotten, but then they're redeveloped. And so there's these waves throughout our existence that, you come to a high point of existence of peace. And when you have peace, you have more time to use your mind for better things. Science, culture, family, all these wonderful things. But then you go down the other side is when conflict comes up. Those wonderful things disappear, and all the negative things are tantamount. So I think like we're in a good time to draft this easement, because look at the earth. We forgot to take care of her since the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of harm that's been done, but we're going back up. And what I've been noticing in our cultural centers, a lot of young people that are in college or even high schoolers, their eyes are wide, their minds are open, and they're concerned. And so they're drawn to native philosophies about the earth. And that's all it is. It's a philosophy. And so when you have a philosophy in your heart and your soul, any decisions that you make in your life, that will be there first. And that's the way folks like the Land Trust, other organizations in the area, students. So I think we're going back up that hill. And so this easement, I'm gonna put that in there. I'm not sure how to write it, but it's how we go through these waves of forgetting, but we're now going back up.
Let me follow that up with a pretty straightforward question for you. Where exactly will the new cultural center be located, perhaps in relation to the current cultural center?
I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. So this is a map of the area. Excuse me. This is the whole 333 acres. And right now, our little cultural center is in this area here down below. And this land, um, again, with the land trust and other donors, we were able to acquire it. So the darker green, that is going to be under the easement. And that's, we're going to have trails and camps, hopefully down the road and hopefully soon. And by the way, there was words getting out in our communities about our project. And I just had, I met a younger lady from Akwesasne who works with youth. And, she does a lot of activities outdoors, and I think she hikes every day. She's always up in the mountains, and she wants to work with me and work with us to develop programs for youth. That I just got a call from another a Mohawk woman who just heard about this and is all excited about it. He says, "That's what we need. We need to bring these kids to the mountains." And so things are rolling. And this is without any effort really getting the word out. It's just events like this, different articles in the paper, these discussions and these relationships between organizations. Now, this area here, there's about roughly 24 acres, and that's this here. And so this is that work building, the first initial stages. And if we have enough funds, we'll develop the road and start beginning the excavation work to build a new building. And this type of building, by the way, it's a new way of building called passive building. Basically, it's extra thick walls, double, triple insulation so that your energy consumption is minimal. And this is the old building my grandpa built in 1954. Here's another image of it. It doesn't look like much from the road, but once you go in those doors, it just almost takes your breath away. And so, like I said earlier, is I really don't want to alter it too much, but we have so much stuff that we can spread it out a little more, and that'll be nice. And so the building itself has become an artifact. And so I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're actually going to lift it up. It's on piers, move it down the road to the new place. I don't know if I want to be around that day. Make me nervous, but this is the layout of the place. And this is the original museum in the middle. And so you'll enter here in a lobby, and you'll have an orientation area, and then I'll begin here, our origin story, our creation story. And so throughout this space, it will be more of a chronological narrative of our existence. Because presently, this old museum, when you go in there, you don't know where to begin. You don't, there's no beginning and there's no end. There's just, it's all over. There's so much stuff. It's amazing. But you need one of us to take you through it, to explain things. But this way, you can walk through and begin with creation in the new exhibit space with more about, you know, our society, our clans, our food, you know, all the basics, our traditional homes, political structure, the Great Law, a little bit about wampum, then contact with European in that disruption and how there were people that came to help preserve our culture. Then, of course, the residential schools. And then I'll be in an area here that'll be about where we are today. Because that's another thing is a lot of folks think that there's no more natives left, you know, or basically they know nothing about us and that we're here today, or they come into the museum expecting us to look like, all feathers, and that's what we wear every day. And again, those stereotypes exist, and I hear it every year. And so I have to have thick skin because those words hurt. But I got to remember that it's not their fault necessarily. It's the educational system. And over here will be a performance area, storytelling, singers, all kinds of ideas. And then when you come back here, this area will be, I want to tell the story of my grandfather. He was an amazing individual in his work, and he helped preserve our culture. And he was one of the best teachers I think I've ever known. And then you enter the old building, and it'll be pretty much left the way it is. Just I want people to experience that. And there's a feeling you get when you go in there that I've heard it referred to as you feel comfortable, like you're in your grandfather's attic, that warm feeling. And I want to keep that feeling. And then you exit. And of course, I got to have an art gallery because I'm an artist. And, it won't just be my stuff, but we'll have rotating exhibits and folks from other reserves. And you can't leave without visiting a gift shop, of course. And so that's the plan. And here's a couple renderings. And the architecture is going to be similar to the longhouse. In the longhouses we lived in, excuse me, went according to a clan. In our society, the women owned the home. That's her house. And all of their children belong to her. And if when the son gets married, he moves out and moves in with his new wife and her mother, and they start their family. The daughters, they stay with their mother and they add on. So if you have a lot of kids and they're all girls, you keep adding on to the house, and that's why they call it longhouses. And so the architect and I met a number of times, and we wanted to keep the architecture similar to a longhouse. And there's another view. And this mountain, by the way, I think they call it Haystack. But my whole life, my grandpa always called it Mohawk Mountain. And that is where his ashes are. And my grandmother, they're up top. And so I knew I wanted a view of that mountain. And also, it just was a coincidence that it faces east. In most Haudenosaunee homes, the doorway faces the sun rising. It's always orientated east. And so that works out just perfect. And here's our concept of our sign. And there's a wampum belt design that they call it the Hiawatha belt or Hiawatha belt, with the tree of peace in the middle, the Mohawk, Oneidanadaga, Cayuga Seneca, joined together by a path of peace. And the turtle is from our creation story. And the turtle is basically the land you're on. And it's from the story of a woman came from above a sky world who brought life to the earth. But back then there was no land. And a turtle surfaced, and she was able to land on his shell as the ducks or the geese slowed her descent. And she planted the first seeds on that turtle shell, and that turtle started to grow. And that became the continent. I figured that's a good symbol. So that's our design. And then the last one, that's a view, hopefully a view of the mountain.
And Dave, can you quickly remind us of your grandfather's name?
Oh, his Ray Fadden, his Mohawk name is Tehanatolo. And Tehanatolo was a fitting name for him. English, it means, well, there's a literal way, it means he splits the pitch. And when I mean pitch, like, how a pitch grows on a pine tree? Well, what that means is your vision. When you're in the woods and you look through the woods, or how you move through the trees, you split the pitch. Tehanatolo. And I always thought that fitting for him because, man, he was good in the woods. He didn't need a compass. He just knew his way. And I can remember following him into the woods, and I remember it was getting dark and I was getting a little nervous. I was like, we're going to have to camp out. He goes, no, I know my way. And poop, sure enough, we came out right at home. But that's my grandpa's name.
there's one question here that I thought was really in keeping with the theme today. So I'm going to read this pretty much verbatim. And it's to you, Dave, but Chris, I think that you could chime in and have a lot to say too. The question is, Dave, most days I step out into my backyard. I go for a walk with my dog through the woods. Towards the end, I stop. I take some breaths. I start to say out loud what I'm thankful for: the fresh air, the sky, my limbs that function, the forest, my family, etc. It's a good moment and it's good therapy. I feel uncomfortable to do this in public with friends and the general public. How can I build up the confidence to share these expressions with more people, as I feel it would be stronger shared with others?
That is a good question. And it's great you're doing that. That's the same concept as your own verbal expression of gratitude. Um, Everybody's different. Everybody approaches things different, but that's like I wanted to make sure that people understood that this commonality that we all have about gratitude is what brings us together, rather than set us apart. And like I mentioned earlier, is like as Indigenous people, we say it, before any business takes place, we just say it. And again, sometimes it's short, depending on the speaker, sometimes it's long. Um, I don't know. That's a good question. Like, how would you approach others? You might run into some, negativity, of course, but you might get others that would feel grateful for that, hearing those words. And, you never know until you find out. And even as I was taught, you know, every day we do this. You do this when you get up and you do it when you go to sleep. You just can quickly do it, or like you on your walk, you can't help but appreciate certain things. But we do it every day. And like what I do is a lot of times I'll be driving and I'll just go through these things, and my thoughts go around, and I don't say them out loud. It's in my mind. But gatherings of people, before anything takes place among our people, they say these words. And so I don't know, you might have to craft it your own way. I don't know. It's a good question.
Thank you. That was great. And thank you to the person that asked that question. Chris, this one's for you. Has this initiative and this project changed how the Adirondack Land Trust views the use of other lands under its control?
I would say yes, in a way, in that, so as I said, we've been around for 40 years. And so we still steward lands that were protected, and the ideas on what was important to do about protection from 20, 30 years ago. And sometimes we look at those techniques and things and we scratch our heads and I'm like, is that really what we meant? And it's it's a conundrum, because we know what the intent is, and we know what, how we want the lands and the waters and the plants ultimately to be. So we do now think a little bit more about, it's not so much about saying what can and can't be done in certain situations, but about what happens when you do those things. We have situations where, for example, we take people with, certain mobility issues. Like sometimes it's a common thing to say no motor vehicles, right? Well, motor vehicles sometimes, or, motorized, wheelchairs or things, are the ways that people can get around. And it's, when it's done in a way with respect, to the land and things like that those activities the land, it's fine with the land, and it brings people closer to the important things of nature and connect them to. So yeah, without getting a lot more wonky, it certainly is infusing like the broader work, and not just this specific project, for sure.
Great, thank you. One attendee is curious about kind of more details about the easement. And I think, that goes along with another person who has questions about whether or not any of the language can be shared. And I know, this is a work in progress at this point, but I I'm curious, and I'm channeling this attendee here. Can you share any details about what and maybe how the easement permits the center's cultural activities? And are there any unexpected roadblocks that you've encountered so far?
And I'm going to guess, a lot of this is coming from some fellow practitioners in the audience. And so first of all, I'll say, Kathy, you're welcome to put my email address in the chat because I think, I might put the other half of the audience to sleep in all this. But I will say that when it's done, because it is still being crafted, it will certainly be something that we would share, and maybe even before it's done, get some feedback on, because it is a new sort of thing. Like Dave said, Dave's working with people to get feedback. I'm working with people to get feedback. And but it's not something, to the extent that this is going to work and be something good, we definitely want to share it for sure.
Okay, terrific. Here it is. Protecting land at its highest level is described as preserving wilderness, and wilderness is in quotes. But I'm curious how you think about that term, that idea of wilderness, land untrammeled by man, per the author Howard Zahniser. So how would you describe that idea and that notion of wilderness? How do you think about it?
I can talk to that. Like, there's a lot of words I don't like. Like the one is wilderness, or they always say empty, but it's not empty. It's full of life, more life than any concrete city. Um, this wilderness just puts forth a sense of you're almost afraid of it, and I think that goes to a lot of like oral traditions among European cultures. Like the Sherwood Forest, or the Big Bad Wolf. These tales about these creatures, and they're scary. And our stories are about these creatures that come to life, and they're more personified, and they talk, and they teach us lessons. They teach us things. It's not something to be afraid of. In the wilderness, they also, it's like something to be conquered. I hear that phrase a lot. Oh, I conquered that mountain. It's like, if you did, how'd you do that? And why would you want to do that? And it's the idea of man has dominance over creation, and that this is foreign to us. That's a foreign concept. And just like there's a way to live on the land that looks like nobody's there. You don't, like my grandfather said, go single file. Leave, don't bother the ants. Don't senselessly break branches and create damage. Be respectful. And you can have a lot of people in the woods, and you wouldn't even know they're there if they followed that way. And I never really liked that word wilderness. Uh, Again, it gets the feeling of something to be feared. And I'm more afraid of going down Manhattan than anything else.
So personally, in my arc in doing this kind of work, as a young kid getting into hiking and backpacking, I wanted to go into, those empty places on the map, and go to the wilderness, and explore that sort of thing. And when I started in conservation work, I that's how I thought, right? It's like, going back to that, like re-envisioning what it means to protect. It was like keeping the people out. What I did not know, as you sort of learn more about, nature and ecology, it's not about things, it's about systems, it's about relationships and interrelationships. And it was humans that had as much interrelationship with all these landscapes as a lodgepole pine or a beaver. And now, when you have a certain ethic and respect, like Dave's talking about, when you're in these places, and how, when you go to your grandmother's house, you behave a certain way. When you don't put your feet on the couch and that sort of thing. And there's a certain ethic that you bring to certain spaces. And I think that's a perspective that is important to think about what ethics do we bring to wild spaces, and were they ethics that now cause us to keep, oh, we got to keep people out because you're just going to mess the whole place up. So yeah, so I think it's a fraught term these days. And I would suspect, Dave, there's not a Mohawk word for wilderness in a sense. Because it wasn't devoid of people. And there were places that, were more people or less people, but nonetheless, humans were always part of these systems, these ecological systems.
Thank you. I'm going to say we have time for one more, and I wouldn't be surprised if this person is not the only one who's curious about this, but I'm going to read a question from a professor at a state university. This person writes, several years ago, our college read Braiding Sweetgrass, and we are now implementing the Thanksgiving address in various faculty and staff meetings. The issue of cultural appropriation has been raised recently, but it is my understanding that the address has been offered by the Haudenosaunee Nation for use by whoever might care to use it. Is that correct? I think people obviously don't want to step wrong and don't want to offend, and yet see the beauty in what you shared with us. So I'm sure this person is not the only one who would be curious about this question.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if there's an actual formal declaration that it's available for anyone, but what I do know is that it is meant for everyone, because when it talks about people, we're all people. It doesn't just say Haudenosaunee, it just says people. And these are good words. It's a healthy existence. And from what I've heard is that anyone can say it. And then my dad, and years ago, back I think in the early 90s, we partnered with an organization called the Tracking Project. And it was a guy by the name of John Stokes who did wilderness survival skills. And I think I was like 13 years old. I did a few camps, and man, I loved it. But they decided to get together to produce a pamphlet of the Kariwatékwen. And my uncle, who is a very good Mohawk language speaker, drafted it in Mohawk, and they did it in English as well. And then produced this book, and it's sold, and it's all over. And then they did it in French, Portuguese, Japanese, Hawaiian. And so there's, I think, 8 different languages it's produced, this booklet. And it's meant to be for everyone. And so what you're doing in your class, that's thumbs up in the way I look at it. Perfect. And that does is it puts all of us in the right trajectory as far as how we should live our lives with gratitude. And you might get others and that was the other thing, some people says, oh, that's a prayer. And I'm like, well, it's a little different. And I never heard the word prayer. And so I actually had to look up the word pray. And it's a lot of it to pray. Most times is you're asking for something, please guide me or help me. You're seeking guidance. You're looking for something. An address is you're talking to that thing, the individual or the entity. It's the other way. You're saying thank you. So it's not really a prayer, but there's a spiritual element to it. And like I said earlier too, is like you can use your own words, how you express that feeling. And but I think it's okay. I'll ask around too.
Okay, thanks. Well, everyone, as you can tell, this could continue for hours. I wish it could and would, but I think there are at least some of us perhaps ready for our early winter bedtime. So we're going to call it a night. With a huge thank you to Dave Fadden and Chris Jage for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge, to DAC for sponsoring, and thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you at a future event, either through the Adirondack Land Trust or the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center. Have a great evening, everybody. Good night.